people more willing to discriminate based on party identification than on race? Do people actually hate members of the opposing party? How willing are people to give favors to members of their own political party? On this episode of the Civic Signal, we'll be discussing Fear and Loathing Across Party Lines, New Evidence on Group Polarization by Shanto Iyengar of Stanford and Sean J. Westwood of Princeton.
And this paper explores the idea of partisanship, which is what political party you're a part of, as a social identity, the same way that race, gender, religion, all of those things are social identities. They look at partisanship as an aspect of social identity.
One of the main goals of the authors in this research paper is to explore what's called affective polarization. Now, the researchers define this as the tendency of people identifying as Republicans or Democrats to view opposing partisans negatively and co-partisans positively. So essentially, how willing are you to give favors to people of your own party, and how willing are you to discriminate against people of the other party? Now, what's hard about testing this with experiments or with surveys is that people are not usually very willing to just admit willingness to discriminate, and they're not usually willing to look socially undesirable by saying, "Oh yeah, I'm just going to give favors to them because they're part of the same party I am." And so the researchers are going to use several different experimental and survey models to not only track what people explicitly state, or say I don't like people because, or I really like people because, but also to track what do their behaviors tell you in a more subtle way? What is their gut reaction immediately upon seeing something? And so we'll kind of get into some of those experiments that look at this in a couple different ways.
So the first experiment that the authors do is a survey experiment. And their hypothesis here is that uh, partisan affect is sufficiently ingrained in citizens' consciousness that you'll be able to measure it. And so they use an implicit measurement of partisan affect to avoid the problem that Sam was talking about, where no one wants to admit that they're discriminatory. And basically, they run a test called a Bayat test, and that's the brief implicit associations test. And it basically measures how fast can you associate your own group with concepts of good and the other group with concepts of good. And the difference between that kind of indicates your level of implicit bias. So the authors use a sample of 2,000 adults in 2012, and they split this sample in half, and they run the Bayat test with half of them on partisanship and half of them on race, so that they can compare how partisan affect compares to racial affect in society. So this graph shows the results from the Bayat test. The first panel here is the implicit partisan affect by party, and the second panel is the implicit racial affect by race. The x-axis here is the D-score, and the D-score is from the Bayat test. It's the difference between the two associations that the respondents are asked to make, and it ranges from -2 to 2. The negative numbers on the left side here are faster associations with Democrats and good, and then the positive on the right is faster associations between Republicans and good. And then in the second panel here, the negative is faster associations with African American and good, and the positive is faster associations between European Americans and good. And then here on the vertical side of the graph are just the labels that correspond with each bar. So you have the parties right here, as well as the races on the second.
One thing that we can see here is that independents do not really strongly implicitly view one party as better than the other, while Republicans and Democrats, to almost the exact same degree, view their party implicitly as better than the other party, or can associate things with their party as being good. And then with race, African Americans are slightly more likely to implicitly view African Americans as good, and European Americans are slightly more likely to view European Americans as good implicitly. But the effect is almost double with the partisan effect when compared to the racial effect. And so their first hypothesis here that you're going to be able to define this and see it even more strongly than implicit bias with race is true. Not only were they able to clearly define this and find statistically significant coefficients to go with it, but the effect is stronger than it is by race. And so they're seeing here that this is a very clearly defined, very strong, implicit, ingrained part of the American people's minds.
So the next studies that they do speak to the behavioral consequence of this measured partisan affect. And the question that they seek to answer with the next three studies is, to what extent are partisans willing to discriminate against opposing partisans in non-political decisions in everyday life?
First experimental design here is really interesting. They take 1,000 people and they tell them there's a scholarship that's been awarded. It's $30,000 by this charitable organization. And the scholarship selection committee is deadlocked on the final two contestants, and they need a panel of individuals to vote to determine who gets the scholarship. And so these people actually think that they're really awarding a $30,000 scholarship to a graduating high school senior. And what's interesting about this is it's a zero sum game. They're shown two people, right? It's a Republican, it's a Democrat, and they have to decide who gets the money and who does not get the money. And the hypothesis here is that people are going to be willing to discriminate against people of the other party in favor of their own party, even when they're less qualified objectively than the other candidate.
So the 1,000 participants are cut in half, and half of them are given this experiment by partisanship, and half of them are given it by race. They're shown the profiles and resumes of two candidates for this scholarship. Now, the partisan group are told that one of the candidates is the president of the Young Republicans, and the other candidate is the president of the Young Democrats. And then the researchers varied the level of qualification between the two candidates. They're given either a 4.0 or a 3.5 GPA. And on the other hand, they're given the racial identities of the two candidates, and then the qualification GPA is again varied.
So what we see here is the top section is going to be looking at the partisan selection task. So these were the people that were shown, a Republican and a Democrat. What we see is that those who are Democrat and lean Democrat vote for the president of the president of the Young Democrats 80% of the time, regardless of how often they are the most qualified candidate. What we see is those who lean Republican and those who are Republican do the same, but with the Republican winner 70 and 80% of the time. And independents here actually will display that they're slightly more likely to choose the Democrat candidate, but that's not really gone into a ton. What we're mostly looking at here is how strong these effects are between the Democrats and the Republicans. With the racial selection task, what we see here is that African American respondents, participants, are more likely to select the African American candidate, and European Americans are slightly also more likely to choose the African American candidate. But looking at those numbers and then looking at the ways that the Democrats and the Republicans were willing to discriminate based on partisan selection, it's clearly a stronger effect across the board for all groups.
So what's really interesting about these results is that the level of qualification that was varied between the candidates didn't matter at all. It was not statistically significant. These average effects hold pretty consistently, whether or not the Democrat was more qualified or the Republican was more qualified. People were willing to discriminate by party more consistently than they chose the more qualified candidate by GPA.
What this graph shows is the probability of selecting the Republican candidate. And what we have here, the three different charts are they're equally qualified, meaning that the GPAs are the same. The Republican has the 4.0 and the Democrat has the 3.5, and then the Democrat has the 4.0 and the Republican has 3.5. And what we see here, I don't know if you can see that trend. They are both up and to the right as you go from Democrat to Republican. There is a very, very small change in each group's willingness to vote for the Democrat versus the Republican in each group. And so what we're seeing here, like Brandon mentioned, people are taking the partisan affiliation of the candidate as compared to their own much more significantly than they are the actual qualifications of the candidates.
So, like Sam said earlier, the scholarship study looked at a zero-sum decision where it's you choose one party and the other party gets nothing. Now the researchers kind of expand these findings into a study where they look at more complex interactions, as well as personal interactions where the respondent themselves is the one interacting with the person of the other party.
They're going to use two different behavioral experiments, and these are very common experimental designs in different fields of research, particularly economics. And so they're not creating these designs here. One of them is called the dictator game, and the other one's called the trust game. Now, in the dictator game, the respondent or the participant is told, okay, we've got this other person. We're going to show you some information about them. We're going to give you $10, and you can pick however much or however little money you want to give to them, and your success is determined on how much you have left at the end of the game. So, in game theory, the theory here is that you really should never give anybody any money because your success is based on how much you have, and there's no chance for any reciprocal action. It's just, do you give it or do you not? So, it's essentially just testing how generous are you, how willing are you to just toss someone a free bone. The trust game, on the other hand, is you're given the $10, you're shown some demographic information about the other person, and you're told you can send as much or as little money as you want to the second person, but we're going to triple it. So if you send them $5, they're actually going to get 15. If you send them all 10, they're going to get 30. And then they can turn around and choose how much money to send back to you. So ultimately, the best thing here would be for you to send them all of the money and then to send you back at least half, because then you end up with more than the maximum that you could have if you had kept any of the money. And so it's just a game to see how much do you trust this other person and how willing are you to bet on the upside.
So they run this experiment with 814 adults, and they play 4 rounds of either the trust game or the dictator game.
So what we see here is on the very far left is listed the party of the participant, and then the next column is the player two, who's not actually a real player. It's just what they told them the other person that they're sending the money to is. And then we see the average amount that the person in that situation sent them. So what we see here is that on average, Democrats are across the board more likely to send money than Republicans are, which the authors actually discussed before they even did this experiment, that this is a pretty well-known phenomenon that Republicans are just generally less trusting of people that they don't know. So they're expecting to see this. But if you look at the gap between the in group and the out group, we actually see a very similar theme emerge here, which is that Democrats are on average willing to send about 70 less cents to the out group as compared to the in group, and Republicans on average send about 80 less cents to the out group as compared to the in group. Now, if we look at the allocating $0, what we see here is that 23% of Democrats send $0 to a Republican player two, and 33% of Republicans send $0 to an outgroup player two. And then with the trust game, it's a very similar story. Democrats are about 60 cents less on average that they'll send to a member of the outgroup, and Republicans, it's about 20 cents less that they're going to send. But again, this is because they're on average going to send about less money. And with the trust game, Republicans are more likely to bet on the upside, and so they'll actually send more to the Democrat than Democrats do to the Republicans, just betting there on the upside that they're going to be able to get more money. If we look at the allocating $0 to player two, it's a very similar story with the trust game. People are less likely to trust members of the other political party, and they're less likely to put their money behind it. After this, the researchers ran a very, very similar game with 1,200 participants where they did the dictator game and the trust game again. But this time, the only thing that they changed was they had a control group where they didn't tell them anything about the player two's partisan identity, and then they added an independent treatment. So they had the control, independence, in party, and out party, and then they tested people's willingness across all four of these instead of only in group or out group.
So this graph shows the results of the second iteration of the dictator and trust game. The first panel here is the dictator game, and the second is the trust game. Here on the side, you're labeled whether or not the player received the opposing partisan treatment, an independent, a co-partisan, or no party of the control group. And then here on the x-axis is the amount on average that they allocated to the other player.
Yeah, and what we see here is a similar but even stronger effect with the last one, which is that people, on average, are only giving the opposing partisan group about $2.60, while they give their own group almost $4 in the dictator game. And then with independents and the control group, where they don't have any information about their politics, they're giving them about $3.25. So this is pretty significant. And then for the trust game, the effects are a little bit tighter just because, again, you're betting on the upside, and there's the chance with the tripling that you'll get more. So it's a little bit of a different game. But here we see the effects are still pretty strong, that people are willing to give about $1 more to their in partisan group than to their out partisan group. And then what they're essentially trying to establish here with the independents is independents are not really viewed as like an aggressive out group. They're not your same in group. And so here they're not getting the same benefits as being part of the in group for your partisan, but they're not necessarily viewed as the other party. And so here their hypothesis about affective polarization, that this is a negative thing, that people are discriminating against people based on their party. The independent factor here is showing that this is the case, that Republicans are viewing Democrats as bad, not just not Republicans.
So to conclude, what the authors establish here is that affective polarization is ingrained in citizens' consciousness to the point where you can actually measure it. It's worse than affect/discrimination by race. And people are willing to discriminate by partisanship more than they're willing to discriminate by race. And outgroup animosity is stronger than in-group preference.
This is kind of a disheartening paper. It's a fun read because, it's with the different experimental games and the different survey. It's a very fascinating study. It's a very well done piece of research. But I mean, what the results are showing here is that people do not trust people of the other party. People have implicit bias against people of the other party, and that people are flat out willing to discriminate against people of other parties. And that this isn't because they just love their own party so much that people of the other parties just can't hold the same standard in their mind. This is a negative thing. People are saying, I hate those people, or I distrust those people more than I trust my own group or like my own group. And that's not a way for a society to conduct itself. That's not going to lead to rational discussion. No matter what your political ideology is, no matter which politicians with their policies you think are going to make the country better, animosity and hatred towards opposing groups is not going to achieve positive outcomes for the country.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the first thing that we need to discuss after reading this is kind of why is this the case? One thing that I thought was really interesting when they were measuring the implicit affect by partisanship, they also measured the explicit affect by partisanship. And basically, the way that they did this is they asked you on a scale of 0 to 100, what do you think of the other side? Now, this measure is one that is influenced by social dynamics. People are going to answer this question in a way that they want to be seen by their peers. And what was really disheartening is that the explicit measure was worse than the implicit measure. And this is the opposite of what we see with something with race, where people are explicitly not willing to admit racial bias, but implicitly you tend to see a larger bias. It was the opposite by partisanship. And so, why do you think people are explicitly more affective by partisanship than they are implicitly?
I think there's kind of two parts to it. I think that first of all, look at social media, turn on the news, listen to what politicians are saying, look at what political commentators and journalists are saying. And this is everywhere. And it's unfortunately coming from the people who we should be looking up to and who a lot of people do look up to. And so they see this as politically a desirable trait to say, oh, if I'm a strong conservative, if I'm a strong liberal, part of that is to have animosity toward the people on the other side. And so I need to report that. I think the other part of it too is that implicitly this you don't see this a ton. Like when I see somebody walking down the street, my first thought isn't, I'm going to really try to figure out if this person is a Democrat or they're a Republican so I can treat them differently because of it. And the authors even bring this up. They're saying that there's one line in the study where they say, by bringing so much attention to this, we know that we're probably going to get a little bit of a stronger effect than you're actually going to see in most social situations because it's not something that everybody wears on their sleeve. But the disheartening factor is when you're actually having a conversation with somebody, or you see a bumper sticker on their car, or you see a sign in their yard, something that indicates their party to you, this is how many Americans are acting. And so we have to, like you were saying, with the explicit measure, there's not as much social stigma around discriminating based on partisanship. And that's an issue.
Yeah, and going back to what you said, the difference between the explicit measure of partisan discrimination and the implicit measure of partisan discrimination suggests that there's actual social encouragement to discriminate along party lines. And this is different than what you see for things like race and gender, where it's pretty clear that there is social discouragement to discriminate along those lines. And this goes back to what you were saying, where partisanship and race are different things. They're different social identities. You choose your partisanship and you don't choose your race. And so the authors suggest in their discussion section that the respondents here and the participants might have this mindset where they feel like it's okay to punish or reward people on their partisanship because those are factors of people's identity that they control.
Now, one thing that it's not necessarily a silver lining or a positive factor in the research or in the effect, but it is something that I've been thinking about that is, um, to me, a way to think about this positively is the what can we do about this question? Because you can look at what's happening on the news, the rhetoric of politicians. Individually, there's really not much realistically that I can do, that you can do to change the entire national partisan landscape. But the positive thing is you can change what things you're consuming. I mean, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, even, Google ads. These things are based off of what you interact with regularly, what you give your time, your attention to, what you're seeking out. And so if you're somebody who's consuming a lot of partisan media that's constantly showing you that you should have animosity toward the other side, then that's going to increase your bias towards the other side. Whereas if you take a step back from this and you say, okay, I'm going to choose to not give my time and attention to those things, then they're going to be shown to you less. And you're going to be able to have your natural human interactions guide your biases and decrease your biases rather than allowing other voices to be so loud.
Yeah, and speaking to that, it's pretty clear that the news and the rhetoric from politicians encourage this kind of social discrimination. And like you said, as an individual, we can't do much holistically to solve this, but you can change how you act as an individual. Politicians use this kind of inflammatory and polarizing rhetoric because they've found that it's electorally advantageous for them to do it. Voters reward the kind of rhetoric. And so as an individual, you can choose to not engage with that kind of thing and not reward that kind of rhetoric. And that's difficult when there's only two parties because it's not like if your side uses polarization rhetorically that you can just jump to the other aisle and vote to the other side because that's not going to represent your policy preferences. But I think that this is something that can heavily influence like primary races where in general, your party preferences are represented across the board, and you can choose which candidate uses this kind of rhetoric or not. And I think that that could go a real long way to help mend this affect between parties.
Now, not to end on a dismal note, but one thing that we need to recognize here is that this study was published in 2015, and they were running a lot of these experiments as early as 2012. I think likely we would find these effects even stronger if we ran this today. And certainly it seems that our society is trending towards heightened partisan affect. And so, with society trending in this direction, it really is up to individuals to choose what are you going to engage with? What sources are you going to go to get your entertainment, to get your information, to become informed about politics? And what politicians are you going to support? And again, sometimes you're just going to have to make the decision. Like Brandon said, if you're voting for the president and there's two options who have very different policies, I understand voting for someone who has more inflammatory rhetoric, but has policies that you think are going to further an agenda that you find very positive. But there are other ways that you can do this, supporting other kinds of politicians in the primary elections, or focusing on other races like local elections that have a big impact and typically have a much lower bar for rhetoric. And so it's just up to all of us, and we have to take account for ourselves and to say, it doesn't matter what this society is trending toward. I'm going to focus on not having animosity towards other people.
And then what it really goes down to in non-political decisions is not letting this form of social identity be a factor in discrimination. The same way that we try really hard not to be racist or sexist, we need to try really hard not to be affective by party in our non-political lives as well. Well, thank you for watching. This is Brandon and Sam with the Civic Signal. Today we discussed fear and loathing across party lines, new evidence on group polarization. A citation for this is in the video description, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future videos that we're going to make discussing more political science literature and how it applies to the political climate and how we should behave politically.
Do people discriminate more based on, you can't laugh at me. Do people discriminate more based on partisan identification?
I'm sorry, I can't do it. Okay.
Okay.
All right. This is the time. I'll just keep it locked in.